Mr. Trump is quite capable of changing his mind and his policy day after tomorrow. And certainly, as far as individual countries are concerned, they will be facing quite different tariff regimes in the course of the next 3 months. So for Bangladesh to rush into and try to be the first in the queue to determine what we will concede, and we seem to have already conceded that, may not be a particularly good strategy, because another 50 governments are also engaged in bilateral negotiations. And until we have a better idea of what will be the outcome of their negotiations, for us to then negotiate our own position is rather like a poker player putting his cards on the table when the other people with whom he is playing poker have got their cards concealed in their hand. So this, I think, is a very important point you have to make. Tomorrow, Vietnam, obviously because it has got a much higher volume of trade relations with the United States, will be at the head of the queue whilst they are carrying out their negotiations. And we will then see, on the basis of give and take between Vietnam and the United States, what type of tariff concessions will come out of this process. On that basis, this table at table 7 of Mustafi's, where he is given the comparative exports of RMGs of a whole group of countries, will then determine what will be the nature of competition. Because today, we don't know what will be the competitive position with Vietnam. If Vietnam, for example, can manage to persuade the Trump administration to reduce its tariffs back to 10%, this will create a whole new negotiating problem for Bangladesh until we actually know what we are up against. Now, for example, in the list he is given, he's got a country like Honduras. Now, Mustafiz, Honduras is part of the AGOA, is it not? Zero tariff? It is the Caribbean. No, but don't the Caribbeans also have zero tariff access? I would imagine that they. So now, in a range of products, they can now, if they are getting zero tariffs, they can be operating in markets where we are competing with them, and they can then take over our entire market in that particular situation. If you look up the table at Deccan, and look under Honduras on items such as sweaters, pullovers, and t-shirts. T-shirts se to sabse bada export hocche from Honduras. Then similarly, sweaters, pullovers. In all these areas now, no, but I'm saying that after the negotiations, you don't know what you will be left with, because we don't know whether we will be left with 10% at the end of the negotiations, or we will be left with 20%, or we will be left with 47% as an aggregate tariff. So everyone is operating with unknown variables in terms of what they will have to face. Now, over and above this, we don't even know whether this tariff regime and the underlying policies are going to themselves continue. After all, overnight, he can suspend the application of the policy for 3 months. Now, day after tomorrow, or at the end of 3 months, it can be extended for another 3 months. Then Mr. Fazlul Haq's customers sensibly may place very big orders with him in order to take his imports into the United States. But this may become counterproductive for Mr. Fazlul Haq. Why may it become counterproductive? Because if you export too much to the United States, then the trade surplus with the United States is going to go up. And our tariff will also go up, according to the formula of Mr. Trump. So we are engaged, from what I see in this discussion, in an internal contradiction amongst ourselves. I mean, one group of people is giving all sorts of ideas about how we can increase our exports to the United States. Others, in a somewhat less confident tone, are talking about how we may increase our imports, but they are not very certain how we can increase our imports, particularly if you're operating under MFN conditions, because if you apply all the conditions that you are going to offer to the United States and you offer it to everyone else, then as Mustafiz has pointed out, everyone will then be on the same footing. So today, the import regime that you have is based on competitive market conditions. So Shams, who is importing cotton, is importing it on the basis of what he thinks is his most profitable way of doing it to make his denim exports competitive. In that market response of Shams, he is only importing 20% of his cotton from the United States. Now, are we, in order to accommodate the US by attempting to raise imports, going to compel Shams to say that no, you have to import more cotton from the United States? This, as I had pointed out in an earlier discussion, will be a return to command economics, because instead of letting him function according to market principles as a profit-seeking businessman, government is now ordering him to modify his market behavior in order to accommodate what they think is their macroeconomic relationship with the United States. So there is a conflict between the micro behavior of a businessman and the macro expectations of a government. So you have to basically take this into account. Now, what is bothersome, therefore, in this situation is that we thought we would get some advantage by writing a letter from the chief advisor and being the first to put it into the post box. But that may not have been that good an idea until we get a much clearer idea of the general direction of the policy of the US government, and then the outcome of negotiations with some of the bigger trading partners of the United States. For us to then rush in and predetermine our position may not be necessarily to our advantage. Now, here again, what is bothersome is that negotiations which are going on are not going to be conducted exclusively on the issue of import and export volumes. If you are using the USTR demand list, many other factors are involved in that negotiation. And the one element which is not on the USTR list, but which is actually invisibly applicable in all negotiations with the Trump government, which is highly transactional in all its relationships, is the political and strategic variables which may be introduced into the negotiations. Certainly, for the bigger partners, this will be a very relevant factor in terms of the concluding part of the negotiations and what type of tariff regime will prevail for them. That I have certain particular strategic interests. If you accommodate the US in those strategic interests, it will be of some benefit to you in your tariff negotiations. So this again is an unknown element in part of that negotiation. So we are not just engaging in a simple bilateral business arithmetic set of transactions, but with a set of high level of unknowns in the way in which the relationship is actually going to be transacted. Now, what I'm worried about, and I think all of us should be worried about, is this: we have attached a high level of importance to preserving our $8 billion export to the US. And at the moment, our principal strategy involved over here is to initially try to raise the level of imports from the US, and then hope that the export volume that we have can be protected. But we are much more interested in enhancing that export volume. And everyone is looking with great anticipation at the China vacancy which is going to be created. After all, if you've looked again at the table of Mustafis in that, the biggest garment exporter at the moment to the US, even now, is China, with the $17 billion compared to $7 billion compared to Bangladesh. So suppose if you are talking of 145% tariff levels, exports from China to the US would probably come down to close to zero. So who is going to fill that vacuum of $17 billion? Obviously, we will see ourselves competing with Vietnam and Cambodia and every on that list to compete in particular areas. And we have to be, again, very careful, as I told you, that we don't want to become too successful in our export strategy in case it then affects our trade gap. So this factor then suggests that we can conduct our negotiations, but we should wait. We should be watching what happens to other countries. And above all, we should be trying to understand what is the general direction of the policies of the Trump administration. Now, as again Tawfiq mentioned when he was talking about the main objectives of the Trump policy, that number one was export promotion. No, number one was import substitution, meaning to say that they were bothered by the fact that the US was was progressively losing its industrial base, and they wanted to then redevelop the industrial base. So those of you who were students of economics in the 1960s and 70s will remember that we were all talking about import substituting industrialization, and then, of course, the new theories of market derived globalized world suggested that import substituting industrialization should be replaced by export-oriented industrialization. Now, Trump is wanting a US where you are wanting an import substituting reindustrialization, because it isn't that they are going to be setting up new industries. These are all industries which over many years have historically lost their global competitiveness. Now, the aspiration is that they are going to, after all these years, in a highly globalized and much more integrated world, try to restore industries which had become defunct 10 and 20 years ago. Whether that is a reasonable policy objective, if you are following the discussion which is going on in the United States, virtually every economist and 90% of the business community are saying that this is a completely mindless form of economic policy to take the United States back to a world which existed 20 years ago and which they vacated because of their lack of competitiveness. The second objective of this policy of export promotion. Now again, the peculiarity of this policy is that you are seeking to promote exports in areas where you have historically lost export competitiveness. So essentially, you are now using the leverage of tariffs as an incentive to then compel countries who did not find it competitive in the way that Shams Mahmood has already decided to import goods from the US, but to import it from other more competitive sources. So you are then creating a non-competitive element of coercion into the globalized market process in order to promote exports, which again are no longer competitive. So essentially, when we try to accommodate ourselves to this particular process, both in terms of the macro objectives at the global level, and then at the micro level, as it impacts Bangladesh specifically, we have to be very careful then in terms of how we organize our policy responses. We seem to have moved much more rapidly in the belief that this will give us some advantage, but that may not actually be the case. The final thing I would conclude with is that the big element in the whole trading relationship, which is really at the bottom of the whole policy drive, is the US-China relationship. At the end of the day, the area where the US has lost its greatest competitiveness has been with China, both in terms of its own domestic market and globally. And therefore, its first target was China, and China, because it is in purchasing power parity terms, a larger economy today than the United States, could respond in a way which no other country, except perhaps Canada, could actually respond. Now, obviously, a game of what we call tit for tat, meaning I will raise it, then I will raise it, is on. But this is not the way the game is played. This is another transactional world which is being created, both in terms of trade relations, as also in terms of movements of global investment, as also in terms of strategic relationships as they apply in the Indo-Pacific area. So these are all going to be renegotiated and continue to be renegotiated. And so that the final word on what will be the nature of US-China relationships is a long way from being finally determined. And this is then going to be the major macro factor in determining both the policy of the United States and its implication for the US. My expectation would be that we can see what happens, but we should be looking to promote, at least in the next few years, our exports in alternative markets. If you want to try to further expand your market through your greater competitiveness, initially you should be concentrating on the EU, where for the next few years we have got duty-free access, as also in a number of other markets such as Canada and Australia and Japan. And then, of course, the big market opportunities are in the Asian region, Southeast and Southeast Asia, where the greatest increases in global trade, global economic growth, and also greatest sources of investment capital are actually located. So the real lesson is that we need to move away from the uncertainties which have been created by the policies of one single biggest market today, and look to tomorrow to see where the big opportunities lie and accommodate ourselves to make ourselves competitive and to become major participants in the growth of that part of the world, which is the Asian economic universe, which is going to become the dominant economic force in the world over the course of the next 25 years. Thank you.